Welcome to Intellings, where we dive deep into books, ideas, and the minds that shape them. Today, we're thrilled to have Tamara Dean, acclaimed author, essayist, and journalist, joining us to talk about her latest book, Shelter and Storm, At Home in the Driftless. Tamara's writing explores the deep ties between people and the land they inhabit. In this new work, she takes us into the heart of the Driftless Region, a rugged, untouched landscape in the American Midwest, and offers a powerful meditation on place, ecology, and belonging. Let's begin. To begin, Tamara, what was the initial spark or personal experience that led you to embark on the journey of writing Shelter and Storm?
Yeah, so my partner David and I were looking to start over. This was around 2004. We had been in offices working at computers all day, and we imagined we would like to try a life where we could have more outdoor activity, where we would be closer to nature and breathe cleaner air and drink cleaner water. So we had a bit of romanticism around the back to the land idea. So we looked around for places where we might start over, and we found the Driftless area, which really wasn't too far from where we were living at the time in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's a remarkable area. I'll get into that in a minute, but we fell in love with the landscape. So once we moved out there, it seemed as if every time I stepped outside the door, something else miraculous or amazing would happen. And I had been primarily a fiction writer at the time. I also wrote technical textbooks for to make a living. But once we were out there and all these dramatic things started happening, like the fire and the floods and the tornado and mysterious animal behavior and odd neighbors, I thought this beats any kind of fictional plot line I'm coming up with for my stories and novels. So I turned to essay writing at that time because I wanted to explore these mysteries and this amazing material that was just falling, in front of me, waiting to be explored. And that's how Shelter and Storm came about. In the beginning, I was simply writing these essays. I hadn't intended to compile them in a collection. So that came along much later, probably after 15 years of living there.
The Driftless region is central to your book. How would you describe the unique character of this landscape? And what aspects of it resonated most deeply with you on a personal level?
The Driftless area is so unique. It's 8,500 square miles. Most of it is in southwestern Wisconsin. A little bit of northwestern Illinois is included as well. And it's unique because it's an area where the glaciers, maybe 24 of them, people aren't sure, none of them came through there. So it lacks the drift, and that's what geologists term the silt and sand and pebbles and boulders that glaciers push ahead of them as they move forward and then leave behind as they recede, and thus the name Driftless. What that means for the landscape is its topography is entirely different from the rest of the Midwest. It has steep limestone bluffs and narrow river valleys and these clear spring-fed streams. It's just magical. You look at the rest of the Midwest and it's so flat. And also, because the Driftless area isn't flat, it wasn't a target for the giant agricultural operations that have plowed up so much of Illinois and Iowa and other states with corn and soy fields. There is some of that commodity crop farming going on in the Driftless area, but there's also a lot of small family farms as well as farmers who are doing sustainable kind of growing, whether that's organic vegetable operations or grass-fed cattle. So its topography has influenced its culture. It's also one of the least expensive places in Wisconsin to live, and that, in addition to the landscape, attracts a lot of, independent thinkers, DIY people, inventors, and artists. And that was appealing to us as well, although when we chose the place for our new home, we didn't know about all these people who had come there. It's really been a refuge for millennia because Ho-Chunk oral history tells of their ancestors being pushed from what is the current Green Bay area southwest to the Driftless area when the most recent glaciers advanced and forced them to migrate. So that's over 10,000 years ago. And then it's become a haven for all these back to the land kind of folks. It's also a refuge for some rare and endangered plant and animal species. So I hope that you get a chance to visit because it is just magical.
The title, Shelter and Storm, suggests a duality. Can you elaborate on how these two concepts, shelter and storm, manifest throughout your narrative, both literally and metaphorically?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I was struck with so much material, and some of that came in the form of storms, whether they were floods. And by the way, we had 7 record-breaking floods in the years that we lived there. So that area of Wisconsin is really experiencing more frequent and heavier rain events with climate change. So there were the literal storms, the floods, the tornado, the fire, but there were also figurative storms, from our illnesses to our relationship difficulties. At the same time, we were there seeking shelter, looking for refuge and comfort, and we built our own shelters. We built a yurt first of all, and then we built an outbuilding which served as a garage and a shed and a wood shop, I guess, out of straw bales. And then we built our house from compressed earth blocks that we made ourselves from our own clay subsoil and some sand that was dredged from the Mississippi River. You could get it free for the hauling because they need to keep dredging those shipping channels to keep them open. And then a little bit of Portland cement. So we created our own shelters, literally. And we also created shelters for other living beings, whether that's the pollinator habitat. We tried to restore or turn a hayfield into a restored prairie. And they also face storms, whether those are, the type of farming techniques that poison the water or spoil the land and don't consider regeneration or the future, those short-sighted farming practices. So again, each of the essays in the book embodies that contrast between shelter and storm, whether it's us and human situations or for the living beings around us. I'm really interested in that contrast, and so even though I wrote more essays than are contained in the book, they didn't make it into the book because they weren't embodying that kind of contrast, and maybe they didn't, as a result, add up to more than the sum of their parts, or they didn't create something larger.
Beyond a geographical location, how did the concept of home evolve for you as you immersed yourself in the Driftless and documented your experiences?
Well, David and I hadn't been together all that long when we moved out to the Driftless area, so we encountered the most astonishing, wonderful experiences as well as the most challenging or gut-wrenching. So it came clear to me after years there that my home was wherever he was. That was a big evolution in the idea of home for me. And we made it through these storms, whereas a lot of people who had the same lofty ambitions as we did of making their own home and living off the land didn't last. Those couples broke up. So we felt, we're a team, we're in this together, and we were determined to make that work. And then also, living so close to nature made it clear that we share this place with all these other beings, and home began to include the landscape, its terrain, as well as the plants and animals around us. We had mink and pheasants peering in the doors. We had a crane couple who lived in the vicinity and came in the yard almost daily during the summer and brought their young one, which is called a colt, walking by our back door. We had meadowlarks fledging off of the clothesline, and of course the deer and raccoon and the other species that were all around us. It became clear that we're not only influencing each other, but we're sharing this place and interacting. So that's another aspect of home. And then finally, I would say that it became home because of the community. This was a community where people helped each other out in times of trouble. They did that for us when our fire got out of control on the prairie, and also when our rainwater cistern, which was our only domestic water source, mysteriously went empty while we were on vacation. People just stepped in to help, and that community was really home.
What was the most surprising discovery you made, either about the Driftless region itself or about your own relationship to nature during the process of writing this book?
Guess the most surprising discovery came late in the process, and that was because I wanted to have more background for the preface of Shelter and Storm, which I wrote very late, probably the last part of the book I wrote. And I wanted to understand better the history of the Driftless from a geological sense. And I discovered that, I mean, I knew it was unique, but I didn't know that it was disbelieved by geologists. From the time it was described in the late 1800s to as recently as the 1980s, some geologists didn't even believe it could exist because it was so improbable. This small area that had been missed by all the glaciers. How did that happen? Because the area isn't higher in elevation than the surrounding land. It isn't more porous. It was just a weird series of coincidences that happened again and again to cause this area to be missed by the glaciers. So that was the most surprising thing I learned during writing the book.
You incorporate personal reflections throughout the narrative. How did you balance sharing your own vulnerabilities and observations with the broader themes you explore?
You know, I'm fond of William Faulkner's line, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the only story worth writing is the story of the human heart in conflict with itself. That was in his Nobel Prize winning speech. And I think about it often because it requires us to examine not just our desires and gains, but also our failings and insecurities and fears. And I try to include that in my work, but it isn't a natural inclination for me to reveal a lot. And I also know that vulnerability is a strength in writing. That's how we grasp readers' attention and keep it because they can relate to that. So I do push myself in that direction. And it isn't until later in the writing process that I get to the theme and the meaning making because recording details comes easily to me. In fact, I'm sort of a compulsive writer. So if I have a meaningful experience or encounter, I do often go home and write down what happened right away so I don't forget. So in Shelter and Storm, everything is true, but also the dialogue is as faithful as I could get it to what actually happened because I do write that down. But those are easier for me than, you know, coming up with what do I mean by this and what does it all add up to? And if you're a writer, you know that that is often the hardest part to come to an ending that resonates and that adds to everything that's come before. As they say, the best endings are both inevitable yet surprising, so that they contain those elements.
Could you discuss a specific moment or encounter in the Driftless that profoundly impacted your understanding of its ecology or its community?
Yes, a very specific moment among many that were striking to me was on the morning of August 28th of 2018, and it was probably around 5:15. It was before dawn. I stood up and I stood by the window in our bedroom and I heard an ocean's roar. And I thought, oh no, it had been raining all night, and that was the same ocean's roar that I had heard during the record-breaking flood of 10 years earlier in June 2008. And I thought, oh, this flood is going to be as bad as 2008. It was this sinking feeling. We hadn't so far been affected by the floods. The little river in our house, however, during the 2018 flood went from its usual 40-foot wide span to cover a quarter-mile wide floodplain field across from our house. And by the end of the time there, that day, I should say, the dams upstream had broken and a 500 million gallon reservoir was rushing downstream. And I thought, we're going to have to evacuate. The sheriff was evacuating people right up to our house. We didn't have to. The floodwaters rose as close as 20 feet from our back door. And we were marooned, though. All the roads leading out from our house were underwater. That struck me not only because of the event of that day, but also because it was called a 1,000-year flood. And as I said earlier, we had 7 record-breaking floods in that time. This was the worst, but we knew that because of climate change, it was going to keep getting worse. And I felt I'm not safe here. I don't feel that this little river that so enchanted me is the same place, and it has sort of betrayed me. But it's also a significant moment in our time there because it instigated this project that friends and I embarked on called Stories from the Flood. We were on the board of a nonprofit writing center called the Driftless Writing Center. And we knew about the research by James Pennebaker and others that show that people can write about their traumatic experiences and that helps them heal from those experiences. So we envisioned this community-wide program in which we would facilitate people writing about their flood experiences. Everyone survived that 2018 flood, thank goodness. Homes were washed away, bridges, livestock, so much was washed away, but nobody was killed in that in our area. So anyway, we did collect over 100 stories of people who had survived the flood. They didn't all want to write. We learned pretty quickly that it's not everybody's thing, so most of those stories were captured on audio. And I did notice after collecting dozens of those stories myself that people seemed lighter when they left the room after they had told their stories. And so it felt as if it was healing. You know, people can recast themselves and recognize their strengths and how others helped them. And then, as other parts of this Stories from the Flood project, we transcribed all the stories and we took excerpts and published them in a booklet, and we also shared those excerpts and insights with policymakers and planners. And so, for instance, a legislative aide who came to one of our events and read those excerpts said, I never realized how badly people need better mental health resources in this area. And policymakers and planners are still using the stories that we gathered in that flood, post-flood time to inform, land use policy and also emergency management approaches. So what was a striking and devastating moment in our community's history and also in my personal experience turned into something more.
The book delves into the idea of living in harmony with the land. What practical lessons or philosophical insights did you gain about sustainable living during your time there?
So many. As I mentioned earlier, there's this idea that, we really are interbeing with others on the land, not just humans, but we're interacting and influencing each other. I would also say another lesson or insight I gained was that nature doesn't recognize human timelines. I had tried to restore a prairie in an old hayfield, and I got a grant to do that. This was after 2014, when President Obama decided that, we really ought to put some money into pollinator habitats because all these pollinators are losing habitats and their populations are declining, and they are what help our food grow, and without them we're really in trouble. So I got a grant for a pollinator habitat, tried to restore this prairie according to this government document that was pages and pages long about exactly what you need to do to meet the requirements of the grant and to create this successful prairie. Well, 2 years after I planted the prairie and followed all the instructions, it looked still like a field of weeds and hay. And I thought, what is going on? But I realized, and I was told by a professional prairie restoration specialist, that, prairies can take decades to be restored or to come to life, and you just need to be patient. And all the insects and other animals and plants that live in harmony in a prairie take a long time to come back to life. So it was a big lesson for me in how nature doesn't care about my timeline. I thought 2 years, that's going to be it. That's going to be great. And really, that's the kind of thinking we have in our agricultural system, from larger farmers, because they do follow a pattern and sort of an equation about inputs and harvests and markets, but that's not nature's timeline.
Were there any challenges or unexpected difficulties you encountered while researching or writing Shelter and Storm? And how did you navigate them?
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot because I think I've probably forgotten a lot of the challenges that came up during writing the essays. When I sit down to write something new, or even when I'm reading something new, I silently say this wish, which is, tell me a story I've never heard in a way I couldn't have imagined. And it's hard to do that if you're the person writing it, because, you might think you know all the material and you have a certain way of writing, a style, and here's how it will go. But I want to surprise myself. Any day of writing in which I surprise myself is a good writing day. So that's a challenge. It can be a challenge too, just to get things down. Some days writing feels so awkward and difficult. Sometimes I think of it as trying to tie your shoes while wearing oven mitts. But I'm nothing if not dogged. I just keep moving forward. And when I need more information, for instance, research, I also try to be bold when writing these essays. I would just call up anyone who was an expert on a topic I needed to know more about, or I would go to a museum or a historical society or another organization and ask people, a librarian, ask the librarian, how do I find out more about this? And people were unfailingly generous with their time and expertise. So if anybody is interested in writing, especially nonfiction, but even other kinds of writing, and they need to know more, I would encourage them to be bold and ask people who know, because I've found that most people love to talk about their area of expertise.
How did your previous experiences or perspectives on nature inform your approach to exploring the driftless? And in what ways did those perspectives shift?
Such a great question. I grew up in Michigan. I was raised by a mom who was a biologist and a dad who was a chemist, and they were never happier than when they were outdoors. So when I was very young, our vacations were almost all hiking and camping, some fishing, and but being outdoors was a big part of it. And my mom would name the plants when we went on a hike and repeat those names over and over on that hike and every other hike. So not only did I learn about plants, I learned their names, their forms, their habitat, but I also learned about paying attention and really getting to know nature. But on the other hand, my parents were of the generation who still believed that nature is available to us for plowing and mining and anything else we need to do in order to keep industry going and create jobs and make profits. And I don't share that, excessive kind of view of using the Earth's resources, or I've refined my ideas about that from roaming around and reading. I mean, luckily, my parents also encouraged me to roam on my own and to read a lot. And that's how I came to some of the principles I have now. And in addition to reading and roaming and having that habit of attention, I would say that asking people for more information was a big part of my approach to the environment. I found great wisdom in my neighbors who had lived there for, their whole lives, and their families had been there for generations. And I could ask them about the soil, the quality of the soil, or where the river used to run, or why this, low spot in the field existed. So trying to be open to all of those inputs was helpful.
The book seems to invite readers to reconsider their own relationship with their environment. What do you hope readers will take away from Shelter and Storm that might influence their daily lives?
I hope that it inspires readers to approach the outdoors with an open mind and an open heart, and I hope it ignites their curiosity and also their passion for exploring the outdoors more. I also would like readers to take away the idea that all land is political. This is something we don't think about too often, but if you dig down a little bit, you'll realize that where the borders are, who gets to use what land and under what circumstances, who has been displaced and who lives there now, and who tells the stories of the land, who has that authority and the power to do that, are all political, and that means that humans have shaped those decisions and they can be further shaped or revised. So there's possibility there too for our ideas about land evolving. And I also think that the book could inspire people to act meaningfully with the land and also with their community. And I would encourage people to just find out what that means to them. It might mean, planting a prairie, even if it's just a pocket prairie in their front yard or on their deck. But it might also mean, working on public transportation or becoming a citizen scientist. I feel strongly that we can all contribute to the huge wealth of information gathered about species that might otherwise go unnoticed. Now with our government's funding being reduced around studying these species, more than ever, citizen scientists can step up and fill a gap there. So that's another possibility. Mainly, I hope people are encouraged to interact joyfully with nature, and if they want to take action, to follow what interests them the most. It's no time for giving up hope. And I know there's a great quote from Jenny Odell, an author, who, let's see if I can get it right. She said, "It is in the nature of nature to try to thrive." And rejecting that is just unnatural. So we need to also support nature in trying to thrive.
If you were to offer advice to someone considering a deeper connection with a specific landscape, what would be your key recommendations based on your own journey?
Again, I would say approach it without preconceptions, with openness, because what you see as a field of weeds might actually be a prairie of diverse, native species that are very important. Some might even be threatened or endangered. Vice versa, if you see a field and it looks like a beautiful prairie, it might actually be a field of invasive weeds. So look closer and get to know places before you make assumptions about them. That's one thing I would suggest. And again, get involved, follow your passions. Don't sit by, because so much of nature has gone unexplored. We don't even know the details or finer points about the most common species, such as field mice. We've only discovered about 14% of the species on the planet. So there's endless room for discovery, and if people are motivated to do that, I say go and indulge your passions and interests.
Beyond the natural world, your book also touches on the human communities within the Driftless. How would you describe the unique character of the people you encountered and their connection to the land?
I would characterize the people I encountered as being very neighborly. I was struck by the neighborliness of our rural community. Here were in our township, there were only, I think, 276 people, but these hundreds of people thrown together mainly by a coincidence. We had come to live there because we loved the land, or our families had been there in case of other neighbors. And yet, and so everybody had different backgrounds and probably varying political views, and yet everyone came together in case of a disaster or an emergency or just some kind of trouble. If your truck had spun out in a ditch, people would be there right away to help you out. Or, as in our case, I mentioned before, the prairie fire that got out of control, or our cistern that went empty mysteriously. People just stepped in and helped without asking for any kind of remuneration. Or it was just the way things went. And partly, I think this is because in a rural area, emergency management services are not so quick to arrive, and you have to depend on each other and take care of each other. So that was striking to me about the community.
What role did observation and contemplation play in your writing process? And how did you cultivate those practices during your time in the Driftless?
Be a great writer, you definitely need to have keen observational skills. And you can practice those just as you would practice writing a great sentence, or just as you would practice tennis. You can practice observation. I think any kind of contemplative practice, such as meditation, will help strengthen those skills. And I meditate fairly regularly. I'm not perfect about the meditation process, but I would try to pay attention whenever I was out in nature to all these sensory details. Partly it was easy for me because the Driftless area felt so new and different compared with where I had grown up exploring nature in Michigan. So I was fascinated by these differences, and I would pay attention. And occasionally I would set aside some hours to actually sit on a log and intentionally observe and see what I could find. But that didn't turn out to be very rewarding a lot of the time. I mean, it was beautiful and wonderful to be out in nature, but the observations tended to be subtler, more ordinary perhaps. What struck me most strongly or dramatically was when I was just going about my business, and I was still attuned to my surroundings, and then these remarkable things would come to me.
Were there any particular authors, naturalists, or thinkers who influenced your perspective or writing style while working on Shelter and Storm?
Yes, so many authors. Before I had moved to the Driftless area, and when I was a young person, I was definitely influenced by Henry David Thoreau and Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, and others. When I lived in the Driftless area, I was reading Robin Wall Kimmerer and Terry Tempest Williams, Anna Tsing and Linda Hogan, Kathleen Jamie, and all of those writers had a way of mixing experience and research and reflection and making meaning out of that. And they also introduced an element of, this interacting with the natural world, not apart from it, but not separated, but being integrated with the natural world that I admired. And then there were authors such as Joni Tevis and Mary Ruffel, who were doing more experimental things in form. I enjoyed their work as well. And I'm a huge admirer of Joanne Beard's essays. She makes it look simple. Her style is fairly straightforward on the surface, but when you examine her essays more closely, you see that structurally they're very complex. And I tried to do that in my essays, being influenced by all those writers, to open with a question or a mystery and grab the reader and create drama as if it were a short story, but also along the way meander as my intuition led me to, and introduce information, whether that's factual or anecdotal, and to keep the tension rising as you would in a dramatic arc, and then to end up in a different place and create that meaning that resounds by the end.
Looking back, what was the most rewarding aspect of writing Shelter and Storm? How has the experience of writing this book changed your understanding of resilience, both in nature and within yourself?
We writers throw our work out into the world, and we aren't sure necessarily if anybody has found it or read it. So I would say the most rewarding part of Shelter and Storm, the process of compiling these essays, was hearing from readers, and in particular the reception for the essay called An Ordinary Woman. I had written this essay not even expecting to publish it. Honestly, I was just curious about the possible life of a woman who had been buried on my property in 1876 after what her death record said was probably her 10th abortion. And I was just fascinated that they would put that in the death record, and also that people had dismissed her. It's kind of a long story. You have to read the essay to find how I found this out. But I just went down the rabbit holes on this story. So I thought, well, this one is too peculiar and too specific to a time and place, and too fact-based maybe to even try to publish. But my friends in my writers group who had read it encouraged me to develop it and try to publish it. So I did, and I regarded it in revision as a retort to those people who had dismissed the woman. Nancy Ann Harris was her name. And also as a correction to local history, which said that there were Civil War soldiers buried in that cemetery whose tombstones had been washed downstream in another epic flood back in 1978. But it turned out that there were no Civil War soldiers in that cemetery, and only the 3 children we knew about, but Nancy Ann Harris, who had died of an abortion, and then another woman who had died of the same medical cause, which was puerperal peritonitis, and that could have been from complications of childbirth or a miscarriage or an abortion. We don't know, but it was so curious to me that all the value and valor had been assigned to these fictitious Civil War soldiers, when in fact there were women who had died because they were pregnant in that cemetery. So anyway, this essay came out in the American Scholar, I think in early 2022, and then The Guardian asked me if they could republish it, and then it was honored with a Pushcart Prize mention, and people at my readings this year, and others who have just read the book and sent me emails, have really responded to that essay. So that's a rewarding part about the book.
How has the experience of writing this book changed your understanding of resilience, both in nature and within yourself?
Well, writing the book was another act of patient devotion. I mean, compiling the essays. So writing each essay and getting those published was also a matter of doggedness and patience and faith. But when I put the essays together, I not only wrote the preface, but I also wrote the bibliographic essays at the end, which provide a context and in some cases an epilogue to the events that are covered in the essays. And when I put them all together, I felt that I could see more clearly the connections between each essay and how the theme of shelter and storm progressed as the book proceeded, until in the very last essay, Slow Blues, I'm depicting myself as I was confronted with the challenge of being set back by an illness and trying to thrive in this place we called home, but also feeling threatened by the surroundings there. And I thought, well, what can I do? I mean, I was unable to get out of bed many days. Some days I couldn't even sit at a keyboard. And so I thought, well, I can pick up a pen and a notebook and I can read a book. So I became fascinated by fireflies, and I learned about this rare blue glowing firefly that only lived in our area of the Driftless region, and I was determined to see it. And in that essay, I represent how these blue glowing fireflies are also threatened because their home is no longer hospitable with climate change, and it's not clear, because their life cycle requires a few years underground, whether they can migrate fast enough to find a new home that is more hospitable. And yet they're out there blinking their little blue lights in this, attempt to survive, and that was a sign of hope that I wanted to see and needed to see. So a lot of ideas about resilience are presented in the book and came through as I was compiling it.
If Shelter and Storm were to inspire a reader to visit the Driftless, what would be one piece of advice you'd give them to truly experience its essence?
Well, I would say, in addition to visiting the parks, the state park and the Kickapoo Valley Reserve and the other places that are groomed and meant for visitors, I would encourage people to get on the back roads, whether by foot or on a bicycle, some sort of human scale way, and meet strangers, talk to strangers. Because if you stand there and introduce yourself, they will be welcoming and they will tell you stories that are just out of this world. So that's what I would recommend people do.
What do you envision as the long-term impact or legacy of your book, both for readers and for the appreciation of the Driftless region?
That readers are and continue to be inspired to step outside and be amazed by what they find or what finds them, really. And I also hope that the legacy of the book is a depiction of the complexities of life in rural America today, in a time when sometimes or some people are creating stereotypes or shortcut ways of thinking about rural communities. In fact, of course, it's varied and it's complicated, and people are looking out for each other and people are interacting with nature. So I hope that a legacy of the book is that it's a real portrayal of this, community teeming with life in rural America.
Are there any themes or questions that arose during the writing of Shelter and Storm that you feel are still unfolding for you, or that you might explore further in future work?
To be honest, there were things that happened to us in the Driftless area that were too strange to be included in nonfiction. So they are being turned into, or have been turned into, short stories of some of those happenings. So I'm putting together a short story collection, and some of those short stories have been published in literary journals and elsewhere. And then I'm still captivated by this idea of citizen science. It comes into play in a few of the essays in Shelter and Storm, including the one about native freshwater mussels, and also when we're talking about the waterways in our area, testing the water. So I've embarked on another citizen science project, and we'll see how that develops. And finally, I'm also still captivated by the possibilities of an oral storytelling project, such as Stories from the Flood. And I'd like to investigate that further in different, ways in the natural world. Yeah, so a lot going on.
That brings us to the end of this thoughtful conversation with Tamara Dean, author of Shelter and Storm, At Home in the Driftless. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Intellings, where we explore nonfiction books through news, reviews, and intimate interviews with the authors behind them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.